Indeed.
All right, and with that, I mean, I'm sure more people will join in a couple minutes, but thank you all for being here and being on time. My name is Stephen Blazejewski. I am the Vice President of Membership for the New Jersey LGBT Chamber of Commerce. Just a few housekeeping things before we begin. Our co-board member, Kevin Moot, already mentioned this, but if you could keep your video and yourself muted, video off. It just helps with the loading of the screens as things are going along. Any questions related to the presentation are going to be addressed at the end, but they can be direct messaged to myself, NJLGBT Chamber Stephen Blazejewski. So you should be able to chat those to me and we'll ask those at the end. And with that, I will turn it over to Joseph Renga, who is our president.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you to everybody who's been on here today. This is going to be a really interesting and fun webinar that we're doing. First of all, I would also like to thank the co-hosts, our other 4 chambers that are doing this with us. We have the Connecticut Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce, the Fort Lauderdale LGBT Chamber of Commerce, the Nashville Chamber LGBT Chamber of Commerce, and the Greater Seattle Business Association, who we could not have gotten such a large crowd today without all of them. And also our New Jersey's premier website, and also New Jersey's only LGBT magazine out in Jersey, our co-host today as well. And the reason we wanted to do this was because Community Marketing and Insights, which is the premier marketing and research firm for the LGBT consumer and marketplace rather, comes up with an annual survey every year and this is the 14th year, which defines and gets a huge participation from the LGBT community to see who the LGBT consumer and what our community looks like. This year's report was really interesting to me because not only was it the national report, but as a supporting Chamber of Commerce, we were lucky enough to get a number of participants to the survey where we got our own report. And I thought when I saw the report for New Jersey come in, survey results, I thought this is really fascinating that we actually have a document that shows what the New Jersey LGBT community looks like in terms of their consumerism. And then I thought of all the other chapters who participated in the survey, and theirs must be as unique as ours because they're all over the country. And so I wanted to, usually we would give out the report and just send it out to our members and people who follow us as a piece of information that people might be wanting to know about. But this one was special, and I was having a meeting with my fellow board members, and I said, you know, this is really cool. We've got a New Jersey report. I want to do it in some special way. And it was actually one of our board members who's on today, Kevin Moot, said, why don't you do an event around it? And I thought, oh, wow, that's really a great idea. It hadn't occurred to me. And then I just emailed Community Marketing and Insights to their general email address. And I said, is there anyone at your firm who could possibly do a webinar to discuss the results and discuss talking points and anomalies and things of interest to our community, to business owners, to salespeople, to politicians, to anyone involved in diversity and inclusion at any corporation. And within 24 hours, both founders of the survey, Tom Roth and David Paisley, emailed me back and said, we want to do this. We will do it for you. And so that's why they're here today. And Community Marketing Insights is the premier LGBT research and firm on LGBT issues in the country, if not the world. And we have those 2 founders here with us today. So I am now just going to pass it over to them and say, gentlemen, let us know all the findings about our community in the United States.
All right, thank you, Joe.
How about almost all?
Okay,
we only have an hour.
That's right, almost all of them, just the good stuff.
Almost all. Hi, I'm Tom Roth. I'm the founder and president of Community Marketing and Insights. Dave, let's go to the next slide so we can introduce ourselves. David is running the show. There we go. Thanks, first of all, to you guys. Thanks to the NJ LGBT Chamber thanks to Connecticut, Fort Lauderdale, thanks to Seattle, thanks to the NGLCC, for allowing this conversation to happen, because research really can form the basis, or should form the basis, of any marketing or outreach decision, or even HR decision for a corporation. So thank you all for setting this up. I know it's quite a bit to herd cats into a webinar. We try all the time. So I'm the guy on the left. David is in the middle. I'll let him introduce himself in a second. And Lu Zhen is our research director. She's currently in China, where it's about 2 in the morning. So she's passing on participating, but she's with us in spirit. Dave, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure, and my name is David Paisley. I'm the Senior Research Director at CMI. I've actually been with the company for over 20 years now. And I'm just the person that sort of crunches the numbers along with Lou to produce these reports.
Well, he's a little bit shy there, but David is probably the most educated person on what makes LGBTQ consumers tick. He's produced over 300 studies on LGBTQ community members, and from every way to slice and dice. I think he's quite an asset to the company and also to the community. Next slide, Dave. So just a couple minutes about us and how we approach research before we get into some of our key findings. First of all, we are San Francisco based, but our clients really are all over the world. I'll give you some logos on the next slide, but we're 100% LGBTQ owned and operated. We're among the first dozen or so NGLCC certified suppliers and remain that way. And we've been doing this for about 25 years, which in gay years, that's a really old company. So we're really proud of that accomplishment, and we keep on ticking. And the way we do our research is through a panel. So a panel is basically a database of about 50,000 or more LGBTQ consumers who interact with our research. And they're very representative. Be suspicious of an LGBTQ survey that doesn't really tell you the methodology and who they were asking, because it matters. And we're basically a full service market research firm focused entirely on LGBTQ. Next, Dave. So some of our clients, about 1/3 of our clients are in finance or relative to finance. About 1/3 of our clients are in tourism and hospitality, really where we cut our teeth. We started off in 1992, primarily working with the tourism and hospitality industry, which remains very important to us. And about 1/3 of our clients are really across the board, everything from Google to the WNBA, from Target to AARP. We work with a lot of nonprofits, we work with a lot of retail, we work with a lot of media and other kinds of consumer corporations. We work with the government. We work with on health studies for the CDC and many universities. We did a study for the US Census on terminology. And when other researchers kind of get stuck, sometimes they turn to us for some help. Next, Dave. So I want to introduce the 14th annual LGBTQ consumer community survey. Dave's going to tell you a little bit about the methodology, but the fact that this is 14th annual really matters. The other fact that it attracted about 35,000 LGBTQ community members also matters. You're going to see as we go through our studies that we don't, or we rarely say LGBTQ people do this or think that. Because as we all know who are on this call, LGBTQ is not monolithic. We really are a full spectrum of demographics, and we feel it's really important to portray that, because sometimes the demographics of age or generation, sometimes gender identity, sometimes geography will play an important role in how a survey is answered as well. So we're really proud of this accomplishment, and thanks to Wells Fargo and Google for sponsoring it. I'm going to let Dave tell you a little bit about the methodology and how we approach producing the survey.
Great, and Joe asked me to actually spend a little bit more time on this than maybe I typically would. A lot of times people really aren't that interested in methodology, but he finds it really interesting, and he thought maybe what people on the panel would find it interesting also. So first of all, I want to say is the way we approach the community survey is a little bit different than our other projects. Typically, in our other projects, we just use our panel of 50,000 LGBTQ community members that are on the panel itself. The community survey is a little bit different. It's a partnership with CMI and about 200 other LGBTQ media organizations and events. And they actually funnel through most of the response. So as you can see, all 50 states are represented, but only 28% came from our panel. 72% came from the participating media. So in total for USA, there was just over 17,000 responses, but we also had many responses from Canada and Mexico and other places around the world. So it is a global, but most of the responses coming from the USA. And the other thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is how do you, and this is sort of maybe editorializing a little bit, but how do you research the LGBTQ community? I'm going to say over 20 years, it's hard. It's not like there's one definition of what LGBTQ even means. So when you have a community that there is no strict definition of, it's really hard for all research out there, either CMI research or all the many different research projects you may hear about. It's really hard to have like a consistent base. So sometimes when you're comparing LGBT research groups and studies, it's a little bit like apples and oranges because they are actually surveying slightly different groups of people within our community. So I just want to throw out there that this particular research is a group of people that are interacting with the LGBTQ community through organizations and media and are responding to an invitation from those organizations and media to join this project. What I think this particular research is really good is, and what it's really highly representational of, are the type of people that organizations or corporations can reach when you are sponsoring or advertising in the LGBTQ community or the media, right? So it probably does underrepresent, say, people who are not out, because those people who are not out are probably not receiving the invitations to this particular type of survey. So I just throw that out there a little bit to make you understand that this particular survey has a specific group of people that we're really looking at, and those are the people that you're likely to reach through your outreach activities. The other thing I want to say is that the results are weighted, and it's interesting when you look at LGBTQ research as a whole. Again, as Tom was saying earlier, it's really important to look at who are they researching. And sometimes you'll get these research projects that research, there's like 250 LGBT people researched, of which 200 were millennials, right? And we're just like, well, I don't know if that's really representational of the entire community. But it is true that sometimes a lot of research projects out there are really very millennial and Gen Z focused and don't really find older people in the community. It's also true that a lot of research out there you find that have nearly no women and nearly no transgender and non-binary people represented in the research project. It's almost all gay and bisexual men. So this particular results is weighted to give what we call a balanced response. And we balance between the three major generations, millennials, Generation X, and baby boomers. I want to say that Generation Z, is really about 18 to 22 right now. So we just add them to millennials right now. We don't have enough to really do a Gen Z profile. And that's because as a corporation, we don't actually work with people under 18. It's always 18 or plus. So probably in a couple of years, we'll start making Gen Z as soon as there's enough years there to really have their own crosstab in a sense. I also want to say that we equally weight the response from cisgender gay and bisexual men and cisgender lesbian bi plus women. And the transgender non-binary community comes in about 10% of our weighting. So I just want to throw that out there too. So when we do talk about all LGBT numbers, understand that these are the proportions or the weighting that is behind those numbers. And I also want to say this was a really unusual year. I don't know if you've all noticed, but it's been an unusual year so far. And this participation of people who responded to this survey was between March 14th and May 31st. So that's important. I mean, it's during the time when this epidemic started to really start taking off. And it was interesting from our response is that, that may have changed results this year somewhat compared to the year before, or hopefully next year when things go back to hopefully the old normal, not the new normal, but we'll see with that. But I do want to acknowledge that it was an unusual year while we were fielding this particular research, not just because of just not just because of the epidemic, but many of the issues they're having around Black Lives Matters and the election. It's a really stressful time out there, and it was a really stressful time during the collection of this data.
So I want to just chime in to give you a little bit of background of who the 78% of survey participants came from. Our formula for creating a representative survey is to partner. And we partner with about 150 LGBTQ media events and organizations, influencers, social media, pride events, film festivals, chambers of commerce, community centers, and a lot of the LGBTQ media. So by doing that, we really create a very representative profile of who really the LGBTQ community is that interacts with our media. So that's page 2 of this. And I also want to call out, thank you, Dave, to the New Jersey, no, the next one, forward, yeah. Click, there we go. New Jersey Chamber and Out in Jersey for being foremost in this outreach and bringing in New Jersey residents. And also thanks to the other sponsors and participants on this call. Okay, enough about that. I know some of you probably will duck out early or before we finish our Q&A. So if you do want a copy of this report or links to some of our other reports, just send me an email. It's the fastest way. And I will reply back with the links. So feel free to just send a note, Tom, at cmi.info, and we'll take care of that. All right, let's move into it. And we're gonna have to move a little quickly because we do wanna have time for Q&A. So if some of the presentation seems a little superficial and not in depth, there's a reason. We just wanna get through the whole summary of the report so that you can dig in deeper on your own.
I may also add that we're not going over the whole report. The report is
right.
much longer than we're even presenting today. So there's a lot of data there if you download it. So the first thing we want to talk about is just impact within the LGBT community. And we ask these questions, and I think these type of questions are perhaps not surprising. The answers are not surprising to a lot of people on this call. But one of the reasons we ask these types of questions is because it gives you just good data points when you are trying to do advertising kits, or you're trying to get organizations to sponsor, or maybe if you're a corporation and trying to get the higher ups to buy into an LGBTQ outreach campaign. So we include this kind of stuff every year. Like, corporations that support the LGBT community are more important than ever. 85% of the community agree with that. Companies that support LGBT equality will get more of my business this year, and 80% agree with that. And also note that although there's significant some that say neutral, almost nobody disagrees with that statement within our community. Statements like, I fear there will be a rollback of LGBT equality gains this year. 61% agree and 30% are neutral about that, and only 8% disagree. So there's a lot of fear in our community about a rollback of our equality gains that we have made over the decades.
So this chart is interesting. We do this every year. We kind of want to get a sense of which companies out there are doing the best job of connecting with our community. And this is not only through advertising, but it's also through their own internal policies and practices. So for example, Target, you won't really see advertising in full page yet. Hopefully they will in the LGBTQ media, but they really are a great community citizen. They've done some amazing things to support and acknowledge our community, especially most recently around transgender issues. And that just makes a huge impact. So just to spell this out, we don't provide a list and a checkbox. This is what's called a write-in question. So they just get 5 fields empty, type in the names of the companies who have done the best job over the past year. And you'll see Target, Apple, Subaru, Amazon, Starbucks really rise to the top, and they've been pretty consistently toward the top. You'll see some differences between those who identify as male, those who identify as female, versus transgender and non-binary. You'll also see in the women and the non-binary some brands that maybe you aren't familiar with if you're a gay cisgender man. And that's because smaller companies like Wild Fang and GC2B can make an impact and Tomboy X in the community by showing up. So they've done a great job. And We're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I think it's fascinating that just to recall and type in those names is quite an exercise of which companies are occupying the LGBTQ community's brain. One of the main reasons that they know that they are good corporate citizens is by seeing the brand advertised in the LGBTQ media. So especially those media who are participating in the call, I think this is a great slide to say there are lots of ways to reach the community, but number one is by showing up in our media. The community knows that by being in our media, you're not only trying to get our business, but you're supporting the connection between our community and each other. And so your support of placing an ad in our media makes a deeper kind of impact than just seeing that ad in the local newspaper or a magazine. Sponsorship is also super important. The fact that the brand sponsored an LGBTQ event or donates to our organizations, you'll see 49 and 41% respectively, it makes an impact. So these companies that I showed on the previous slide are doing all these things, and they're making a difference in our community, and that leads to sales. And I also want to say Pride events. Of course, this has been a very, very, very strange Pride year. Many have gone virtual, which is super challenging. But you'll see that Pride across the board, LGBTQ plus, across genders, across generations, feel that Pride is kind of the cornerstone or the keystone of communicating to our community, and it's super important, and it remains that way. So you'll see here 44% indicate that if a brand sponsors or participates in an LGBTQ Pride event, it also makes a difference.
All right, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about finances. I'm going to try to move my little screen here so I can see the whole slide here. And go backwards. Okay, so every year we ask some questions about financial confidence, and these are really uncertain times. And again, the people who were responding were between like March and May. So, you know, the financial picture has changed a little bit since then, but it was during a time of a lot of economic, you know, turmoil, right? So I think what's interesting particularly about this is that this is a kind of question that's been asked a lot in Gallup polls and other kinds of research. So these are pretty standard questions. And that is, what would you say that for you and your family, are you better off or worse off for the past year? Are you better or worse off for the future year? And what we did see is that about 6% of the participants downgraded their financial situation for the past year, and 13% downgraded their expectation for the future year. And it'd be interesting to see if we did this same poll in August, September, how much those numbers probably would have gone up, right? So again, this is back in March and April, before maybe the economic impact of COVID was not fully understood by individuals. So like the rest of the world, the LGBT community does have some downgrades to their economic confidence, and that should be stated, right? Also, what you're going to see on the right-hand side, as we'll see in a lot of our reports, is that we really break it out by generation, and ethnicity, and gender. And you see some of those downgrades are not the same, depending on different categories. So what you're seeing is that baby boomers were the least affected by all this, while younger people were more. The Black African-American community, the Latinx community were much more impacted, at least back then, than some other communities. So do keep that in mind, is that sometimes we like to think of the LGBT community as one sort of monolith that moves in one way, but it's not. We're all of different gender identities, different generations or ages, different ethnicities, different places we live. Some of us live in big cities, some in rural areas, and that influences the answers to all these type of questions. And we just noticed that there were quite a few financial services that were on the call today. And we just want to say that we do ask questions about financial services. I'm not going to go over them really in depth here, but we do have data that can be sliced and diced if you're interested. So I don't know if any of this stuff is really that interesting or shocking, that we have checking accounts and that about half of us have mortgages and that type of, well, older people have mortgages, not necessarily millennials. And we have student loans, particularly if you're young people. But all that information is there and available to you if somebody has some specific questions on financial services. I want to talk about elections and politics and priorities a little bit, because we're certainly in the middle of that election year. And in this particular survey, we didn't ask if people were Republican or Democrats. We actually more looked at it sort of your bias as far as, are you more liberal or are you more conservative? And it's interesting, a lot of times we think of people as being either liberal or conservative, but we also added here moderate, moderate to liberal, moderate to conservative. And I think by no surprise, the LGBTQ community definitely trends more liberal. But I think what is interesting that 41% of the community checked also moderate as part of their description of themselves of where they are politically. And I think that's an interesting, especially when you break it out by gender particularly, you're going to find that gay and bisexual men were far more likely to press one of those moderate buttons than other groups. And that was true of the baby boomers too. So I think slides like this are sort of really interesting about where people are politically and where we're going, especially coming up in the election year. But I think the right-hand side is more interesting, is that we have a lot of tension and anxiety about this election. I don't know, maybe if you asked a bunch of more conservative people, they have a lot of anxiety about this election too. But this country is a high state of anxiety about the election, and it will probably increase quite a bit over the next few months. So it'll be an interesting time for all of us. All right, we also asked the question of these broad concerns. How important are you about these issues when considering voting for one political candidate or another? And the top 5 of all LGBTQ people are LGBTQ equality was number 1, no surprise there. But after that, it was healthcare quality and costs, fair elections, protecting democracy, racial discrimination, and the ability to respond to the pandemic. And it's interesting, when we wrote this survey in January and February, we really didn't even have anything about the pandemic even in the survey. And I remember sitting in a meeting thinking, I keep hearing about this pandemic thing. I wonder if that will be important. Maybe we should throw a response in there about it, and not knowing what would happen over time. So I don't think it's a surprise that these are the top 5. And I think they probably adequately reflect the top 5 concerns of the LGBTQ community. But I think what's interesting, as I said before, is we all don't move in the same direction. And if you start looking at it by gender and generation and ethnicity, which we'll do in a second, some interesting things happen. And some of these things are, I think, unfortunate and sad, actually. But it's not surprised that maybe men or women or transgender community members or young or old all have sort of their own interests. And we see that. And you need to understand that when you're working with the LGBTQ community. And it becomes really important, depending on your product, particularly if your product isn't sort of a broad-based product, but really is targeting a demographic segment. So for example, here, supporting transgender rights, not surprising, it was the #1 priority for transgender and non-binary participants, but I think somewhat sad, actually, and unfortunate that it fell so low for cisgender gay and bisexual men. But at the same time, if we look at supporting HIV education, very high for the men, but very low for women, right? Supporting women's causes, very high for the women, but very low for other gender identities. Now, to some degree, this is not surprising. To some degree, we would expect this, that people are more interested in the issues that are very much personally affect them. But I think we all need to do better at supporting each other. And I think that's what one of the slides like this really show. And we see the same thing with age. When you look at expanding LGBT senior care, baby boomers care about that a lot. Millennials, not so much. Supporting racial and ethnic equality, millennials care a lot more about that, not so much for baby boomers. And that's partially because younger people are more likely to be people of color than older people. And then we also see it by ethnicity. If you look at supporting racial and ethnic equality, it's very high for Asian, Black, and Latinx community members, but I think unfortunately really low for the white, non-Hispanic community members. So, keep that in mind a little bit, is that again, politically, we don't move in one direction either, and we all have our own concerns. All right, a little bit about LGBTQ demographics. And I think this is interesting. Sometimes the LGBTQ community gets stereotyped as that we all live in big cities. And I think that's one thing that our research really clearly shows, is that we do not, as a group, necessarily just live in big cities. A study that we did for Freddie Mac not too long ago showed that about 1/3 of us live in really big cities, 1/3 of us more in suburban and smaller communities, and 1/3 of us in really small communities, even rural communities. I myself, I live in Joshua Tree, California, which is a rural community. And I think sometimes we underappreciate, especially national brands, that we all aren't in big cities. And I think that's really important, because this question is, how LGBT friendly do you consider the place in which you live? And not surprisingly, if you live in a big city, you're more likely to be in a very LGBTQ friendly environment. But not all of us are in that LGBTQ friendly environment. If you go to the bottom, people that live in small towns or rural areas, most don't say that. You know, most say that they are somewhat friendly to maybe even hostile, right? So we need to understand that we're all in different places depending where we live geography-wise too. We ask a little bit about, how do you consider your LGBTQ employer? And to some degree, there is some self-selection here. I mean, I think it's not a universal by any means, but if you're selecting an employer, hopefully you're going to either select or stay with an employer that is more LGBTQ friendly. So we did find that most people were in an environment where they felt their employer was at least somewhat LGBTQ friendly. But I also think it's interesting that those percentage actually were lower for millennials than baby boomers. And these were amongst people who were employed. And that baby boomers, I just think, having more time and experience to make sure they're in a situation that is LGBTQ friendly, while sometimes millennials don't always have those options because they have less job opportunities. We also asked a question about relationships, and what I'll tell you within our clients is that relationship status matters a lot. And that's because for a lot of products and services out there, some products and services are much more popular for single people, and some products and services are much more popular for people who are married or in couples, right? So the concepts, being it gay or straight, marketing to singles and couples is a totally different thing. And they know, many corporations and products, how important relationship status is. So it's important to explore this a little bit in the LGBTQ community also. And I think one thing that you'll see, and what our research has shown through the years, is that any given moment, lesbian and bisexual women are more likely to be in a relationship than gay and bisexual men. So the single numbers for gay and bisexual men are much higher. You'll find that non-binary and transgender participants tend to be less likely to be in relationships than the women, but often in higher percentages actually for the men, especially over time. So what I really want to stress here is that because gay and bisexual men are so much more likely to be single, there are certain products that tend to more likely to be advertised. And I think a good example there is alcohol. You know, you may find that alcohol advertising is more targeted to gay and bisexual men. And one of the reasons is they're more likely to be single and they're more likely to drink, right? So that's sort of one of the reasons there. But at the same time, if you're looking like home mortgages, you may find that the distribution is more equal there, because you'll find that people who are in relationships and who are married are more likely to buy homes. So relationship status matters quite a bit. The only thing I want to say here is that our marriages are actually quite stable. And what that means is that we're actually seeing relatively small percentage since marriage equality of divorces of opposite sex spouses. Actually, the divorce rates right now for LGBTQ people are really quite low. And that's probably because LGBTQ people got married later in life, and they probably knew their partner much longer before they got married. So I've been with my partner for 20 plus years. So I had been with him for well over a decade before we were able to get married. And we had more experience with each other. Our relationship was super solid before we made that decision. So I think that's one of the reasons divorce rates are pretty low for our community. And also children and grandchildren. We do ask a lot of questions in the survey about children. You'll find, again, that cisgender, lesbian, bi plus women are more likely to have children, far more than the men. But you'll also find a very large amount of children within the transgender and non-binary community. So keep that in mind. We're definitely more and more children happening within the LGBTQ community, but it continues to be very focused in the women and transgender community. And then the other thing I want to say is that there's a surprisingly number of grandchildren these days, and it's particularly not surprisingly, older generations or baby boomers. But you'll find that a lot of baby boomers were, in opposite sex couples, and they had children before they came out, and they have lots of grandchildren. And that sometimes surprises people how many grandchildren are out there. And certain types of corporations like cruise lines or some travel companies like say Disney or such are interested in this sort of grandparent LGBTQ community. And again, I think pets are always important. There's always this assumption that LGBT community members own pets maybe more than the general population. And we actually don't see that. We see it's about the same. But where you really just see differences is by gender identity, is that you'll see much higher percentages amongst lesbian, bi plus women and gender expansive community members than the guys. And the reason for that is that gay and bisexual men are far more likely to live in urban environments and where it's sometimes harder to have a pet. So that's something to keep in mind also, but pets are really important to the community. And I think pets are really a great way to use in advertising, even if you're not, say, a pet care company. Is I think we do have lower percentages for children, and sometimes pets do take a greater role maybe in our households, and connecting to the consumer through imagery and messages that involve pets, I think can be really effective for the LGBTQ community. And now I'm gonna turn it over to Tom to talk a little bit about terminology.
And I'm going to be much more of a summary speaker as we move forward, because we do want to leave 10 or 15 minutes for Q&A. But terminology is super important. What is marketing and communications if it isn't resonating with your audience? And if you say or do the wrong thing in terms of our terminology, it can have a huge impact, as we've probably seen in news and speakers at events and so forth. So we've been monitoring this for the past 14 years, and it changes pretty much every year. We've been monitoring LGBTQ, which is right now the most favorable term. LGBT is second. It doesn't mean it's not favorable. It just, we're seeing LGBTQ rise. The term gay is losing favor because, of course, it's exclusive of the other letters of our alphabet. LGBTQ plus really just came around a couple years ago, and it's really gaining ground. Next slide. I want to call out the I. Sometimes you'll see our acronym including an I. That's for intersex, and that is increasingly popular in communications in Europe and in South America, to a certain degree in Asia. It hasn't really caught on as much here. There are very few who feel negative about it, but it's just not really used here. And it's not something that we influence or really can understand, but it's something that we're monitoring as well. And then queer does have, I think, the strongest negative. And if we broke it out by generation, you'd see that older gay men in particular are still uncomfortable with the word queer. It's been termed, it's a derogatory term for many of us who grew up when we were called queer as sort of a negative thing. So be cautious about queer. I would really recommend just moving to or sticking with LGBTQ probably for the next few years. And queer is okay when we're talking to each other. Like I can probably call Joe queer without a lot of discomfort on either side, or Dave. But I really don't want Hyatt calling me queer or Wells Fargo calling me queer. So it's really about context, but it's important to monitor this and follow it. And queer as a term, 49% personally identify as queer among all LGBTQ, which I think is really interesting. But again, it depends who's talking when we use the term queer to each other. And 45% sort of feel that queer is acceptable as an umbrella term for all LGBTQ people. Some say it's a sexual orientation, some say it's a cultural identity, some say it's a gender identity. That's what's interesting about our terminology, and watching it over the years is our interpretation of the terminology really does change and shift. And similarly across demographics, it's more term more comfortably used by women, much less by men, stronger among transgender, great among millennials, not so great among baby boomers. So it's something to watch and to understand. When you're communicating to all LGBTQ, I would say avoid it. If you're communicating to millennial lesbians, maybe it's okay. So it matters, the context matters. So I'm going to talk a little bit about media and events as a communication channel as we start to wrap up here. So we monitor this every year as well. And I think, there's a lot of talk about the demise of the print media. and media in general. And certainly media is heavily challenged right now. But it's still strong in the LGBTQ community. It's a way that we connect with each other, and it's an opportunity for us to really get our perspective on what's going on out in the world. So if you are told that the media is not that relevant, I would really disagree based on the research that we've been looking at. And next. How influenced are you when companies advertise in the LGBTQ digital and print media? 72% indicate they're more likely to purchase. So a client may come to us and they may say, well, we're advertising in the New York Times, or we're advertising in Condé Nast Traveler. Don't the gays see those ads? Our response is, yeah, they do see those ads, but if you want to make an impact, the impact really comes from showing up in our media. And when we look at the difference between the general population media and the LGBTQ media, the impact, again, just sort of looking at this from a different perspective, your advertising in the LGBTQ media has twice as much impact as your advertising in the general population media. And trust is super important, especially now in the world of, everybody calling everybody else fake. We do trust our LGBTQ media far more than the mainstream media. So again, showing up as an advertiser in our media is a place to resonate with our community. Go ahead, Dave.
All right, and then I also want to say again, we only really touched the surface of this particular research. There's a lot of information there if you download the full report. So I know people on this call are coming from a lot of different industry segments, but there is information about all these different types of products and services in the full report. So if you are representing some of these different industries, please pull down the whole report. And then finally, I just want to talk about the impact. We did a research project at Bay about the impact of COVID for LGBTQ travel, because LGBTQ travel is such a big part of the LGBTQ tourism, well, all industries, but so much big part of tourism. So again, this is free for download if you go to our website. And it's interesting. We asked the question for the rest, this was again in May, in the rest of 2020, how safe and comfortable are you participating in these activities while traveling on vacation? And perhaps not surprising, but they all tended to be activities that are a little bit more, I would say socially distant. So hiking in outdoor trails, visiting urban parks or gardens, and walking urban streets and neighborhoods were the things that people felt most comfortable about. But really what I want to stress about when I look at LGBTQ tourism today is that LGBTQ tourism is really, really down. And, but at the same time, the places that we're going tend to be more local, drive vacations, and to places that are maybe a little bit more known as outdoor adventure destinations. But I think the key thing to remember here is that you can create elbow room anywhere. Since we're here in New Jersey, for New Jersey, if you think about New York City, there's a lot of things you traditionally did in New York City that involved crowds. There's a lot of great things you can do in New York City that don't involve crowds, that give you that sort of elbow room. So that's one thing that we're really seeing with tourism, is that those tourism destinations that were more outdoor oriented are actually doing pretty well this summer. And those that are more urban oriented are actually struggling. But one thing I always like to stress is that, social distancing can happen everywhere, urban or rural. And I think sometimes urban areas have to redo their messaging a little bit in order to attract people. And also same thing with hotels. We ask questions about hotels, what makes you feel safe and comfortable? And we ask specifically, if you were to stay in a hotel, what does the hotel themselves need to do? And the answer has to do with disinfection and social distancing at the front desk, and hoteling having posted policies around social distancing for guests as they enter the hotel. So all that kind of thing was really, really important. It's an interesting report. I'm just going to show you a couple slides on that, but you can pull that down off our website.
So to finish up, we're just going to talk about some of the other surveys that are available on the website. You can certainly request this community survey, the full report. I'd be happy to send that to you. And again, if you just send me an email, I'll send you the link directly. The tourism and hospitality survey from last December, of course, pre-COVID, but it has a lot of deeper insights. And then the update we did about LGBTQ travel and COVID-19. We did an interesting study on consumer products that was really kind of touching skincare and beverages and all kinds of consumer-oriented products. So it would really be of interest. And if you're in the health world, then the health survey report. If you happen to be in the auto world, we did a study on auto ownership. So there's a lot of generally available information available from us. Our day job is custom research that we actually can charge for, but we do this really to build the community. We partner with the Chamber of Commerce partners and the media to produce these reports to really raise everybody's boat, whether they're a client or not. And then next. So again, if you want to link to this survey or other reports, I'd be happy to send that to you. Or if we run out of time and you still have questions, just send me an email and Dave and I will reply back. All right, finish slide, Dave. And now turning it back to Joe to moderate some Q&A.
Thank
Maybe
you, Tom.
muted.
I'm unmuted at this point, but thank you. Stephen, do we have questions coming into you at this point?
Yes, we have a couple of questions, so I'll try to ask them in order of the way that they came in. So let's see, first one, this was earlier on in the presentation, but it says, how did respondents discern between, quote, genuine commitment to the LGBT community and simple pandering during Pride events, LGBTQ media, etc.?
Yeah, one thing that I would say about that is I think the way companies, and we have other research on the website that shows this, the way that companies really show their support for the LGBT community is by sponsoring our organizations, by taking political stances when need be to support the LGBTQ community. So what you'll find is the way you build reputation is not through advertising. The way you build reputation is through your community stances, political stances, and support for the LGBT community. But there's a funny thing is that a company can do all that, but unless they tell the consumer that they're doing it, they have no idea. So that's a big problem that we have, and a lot of corporations have, is that they're doing all the right things, but because they have no, in essence, real consumer outreach campaign, the LGBT community has no clue they're doing it. So that's where advertising and outreach have to also go hand in hand with this.
Great, thank you. Next question here, it says, any idea of the breakdown of gender and sexual orientation among the 10% of participants who are transgender and or non-binary? So for example, how many are trans women, etc.?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question demographically. And although I do have the information, I don't have it off the top of my head. But one thing that you'll find is that the trans women community does trend older and the trans men's community does trend younger. And that's really, really clear in the demographics. Also, people who identify as non-binary or genderqueer clearly trend younger. So that's another thing to keep in mind there.
Great. Again, reminder, if there are any questions, they can be messaged directly to me and I'll read them out to David and Tom. The next question is, what survey trends and differences have you seen shift over the last 14 years of doing the survey?
Well, let me start off with terminology. It's something we've really been monitoring year over year. Some of the questions we ask every other year, or some of them are more relevant than others. So they might show up and then they might disappear. But terminology, I think, like I said, it's key. It's the cornerstone of communication is using the right terminology to resonate with the audience. And the terminology LGBTQ didn't exist when we started this survey. Really, when we first started monitoring terminology, the term gay and lesbian was at the top. And I would say in the 90s, when we started this, we talked about the gay market, assuming that the lesbian community felt included. The lesbians raised their hand and said, no, we do not feel included. And so we started to really promote the use of the term lesbian and to be more inclusive in advertising and imagery. But I'd say terminology has really shifted over the years, and that's one key point. I would say geography also has shifted over the 2+ decades we've been doing this, where the LGBTQ community really used to live pretty much exclusively in urban areas where there were more an educated population. We felt safer, we felt more included, we could find each other. The internet changed all that. And now we're more comfortable moving to the suburbs or moving to rural areas or staying put. For younger people who used to just, I can't wait to get out of here, they're staying put because they feel more respected and they feel more included. Dave, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, well, one thing I would really add is that in the early years, it was really only travel and alcohol that advertised to the LGBTQ community. And that's one of the big trends that we've seen over time, is that almost every industry today has active outreach programs to our community. But that wasn't true when Tom and I started. It was travel and alcohol and only travel and alcohol. But those trends still exist to some degree today when we look at the segments. Like if I talk to the media that support the African-American community, for example, what they'll tell you today is that the only one that advertises with them is pharmaceuticals, particularly around HIV and alcohol. And they have a hard time really getting support from other corporation industries. So you'll find with the lesbian market is that the lesbian media organizations still to this day have a really hard time attracting certain segments within the LGBT industry or within industries. Like they're doing better now with, say, family-oriented brands, but there are a lot of other types of industry segments that aren't touching the women's market. So we need to keep that in mind too. Again, it's not just one market. If we look at the LGBTQ and we look at ethnicity and we look at age, it's not an equal playing field when we go across all those different segments within our community.
Great, thank you. Let's see. What types of industry areas are looking to our community that have not previously?
Well, there's a lot of them. I mean, I think right now you're seeing a lot of different auto manufacturers beyond Subaru, outreach to our community. All of a sudden you're seeing, I'm going to say, consumer products. So consumer products like cookies and crackers and sodas and drinks. You know, that was almost non-existent 10 years ago, but you're starting to see it more and more today. And you're seeing it in the context of family-oriented advertising. By family-oriented advertising, I don't mean necessarily children. It could just be couples too. But they have really sort of discovered this market where that didn't exist 10 years ago.
Great. So there are no more written questions. Everyone should have the ability to unmute themselves. So if they would like to ask their question verbally to David or Tom, please feel free to unmute your line and ask your question. Here's another written question that came in. What can smaller mom and pop stores do that can be effective?
Yeah, I think there it's about locally, and I really think it's about your local LGBTQ chamber. I think of a lot of stuff that we talk about in this report tends to be more national in scope, and that makes sense. It's a national survey. But when you're a mom and pop store, it's about the local environment. It's about supporting the LGBTQ organizations, which include the chamber, that are important in your local community. And just localize. Don't think about the big picture. Think about those organizations that are in your hometown.
Great. Another written question. How can municipalities encourage an LGBTQ-friendly business environment generally?
Certainly be active with your local LGBTQ chamber. And if your local community doesn't have one yet, try to find a couple LGBTQ business owners and work with them to start one, right? But I think it comes through your local LGBTQ chamber. Not every community has one. Maybe as a municipality, you need to work towards making that happen.
And one way to do that is to have a meeting or a webinar and just bring as many of your, if it's a general market chamber of commerce, those business owners together and discuss, present some of the research, present some of the case studies, other businesses that have gotten involved in the LGBTQ community, show ads. We see a lot of those ads, but the general market really doesn't know that we were included in a Chevrolet ad or a Coca-Cola ad or a Honey Made Crackers ad. And when you start to show that, they start to think, oh, wow, you know, maybe it's not such a weird thing to be explicitly outreaching to the community, and maybe we should get involved. So I think discussion is really important, and a webinar can certainly suit that.
Great. Another question here, it says, I believe you might have addressed this already, but is there a way to get this data segmented by location to meet the point of going more local for targeting purposes?
Yes and no. And what I'm going to say about that is that, you know, it's 17,000 people. That seems like a lot, but if you're in a small town in the middle of Pennsylvania, we may have 5, you know, that came from that small town. So like if we look at all of New Jersey, which, you know, you'll have that report through the chamber, you'll have that data available to you. But if it's like you're a small town in New Jersey, I don't know how many we'd really have for your area. generally you want to see 200 or more to really look at sort of representational results.
Great. Any verbal questions that would like to be asked, as there's no more written at this point?
So someone asked earlier, I didn't really answer it fully, about sexual orientation and some of the changes that we're seeing there. And I think it is important, is that when we look at our data by age, you're going to find that most older community members have a really clear gay male or lesbian identity for sexual orientation. But when you look at our younger community members, that's a lot less true. And also, you may have noticed we use this term bi plus, and that's because it used to be just LGBT with the B standing for bisexual. We think of it more as bi plus now. But there's all these other sexual orientation identities, particularly for pansexual. And then there's also like biromantic and panromantic that are now happening. And we actually track all that, but we put it under bi plus. Somebody also asked a little bit about the transgender and non-binary community. And it's interesting when you look at sexual orientation in the transgender community, it's really across the spectrum. You definitely have trans women who are lesbian or trans men who are gay men. But I would say more likely than not, the transgender community is going to define themselves more bisexual or pansexual or biromantic or panromantic or some of the other sexual orientations that we have that we track.
Great. So with just a couple minutes left, I will reiterate that David and Tom are available for questions. You can email them directly. Their contact information is still on the screen. And I would like to turn it over to Joe for just a few closing comments.
Thank you, Stephen. And I really have to say thank you to David and to Tom for being here today, for reviewing all this data. To me, this is amazing stuff for anyone who's in the community, whether you're a business owner, marketing, anyone interested in diversity and inclusion. Thank you so much, you guys. This is really, really excellent information and really, really interesting. And yes, absolutely. I see Babs applauding, and I agree completely. Definitely applause for these guys. This is how much I find it interesting. I can't wait for next year's to see what happens next year and what the results will be, and if there are any.
Same here.
Yep,
Can't wait for next year too.
Exactly. I mean, it's such an unbelievably important year with our election, a presidential election, a pandemic, and a census in the same year. My goodness, what a perfect storm of events to see where everything finally ends up, or don't say finally, but does end up. It's amazing to see what the results will be for next year. So thank you, guys. Thank you to our fantastic participating chambers, the Connecticut Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce, Fort Lauderdale Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce, the National LGBT Chamber of Commerce, and the Greater Seattle Business Association, and of course, my personal favorite, Out in Jersey Magazine. Thank you, everyone. And for all of you who were on here today, we had a great turnout. I see we had, just so everyone knows, we had about 125 RSVPs and about 89 people showed up at its peak, I think. So thanks to everyone, and especially thanks to Tom and David. Thank you so much, everyone. And we'll be doing these kinds of webinars going forward, because this is all the information that we all need. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joe. We really appreciate it.
Thank
Take
you.
care, everyone.
Don't forget work on my habits without where we want the elections to get to. All this.
Exactly.
Your audio is
Exactly.
like you're in another planet.
Everybody's
Your
on.
audio's
Make
not
sure to check your local LGBT chamber calendars for new and upcoming events like this. We have some incredible chambers on here. Joe usually mentions the calendars, so I'm surprised he didn't.
I know,
But-
I know.
But please, that is a really important thing. There are incredible events like this where you can feel connected to your community. So please check your local and join other ones across the country. Everyone is always welcome there. I think that's a great part about this community. So